Christine stared at the judge, her eyes brimming with tears, knowing her life was about to fall apart, all because of the cruel trap the vengeful manager had set to destroy her. The judge's gavel hovered in the air, ready to seal her fate. But then, a small voice shattered the desperate silence. "Wait!" Ava, her 8-year-old daughter, rushed forward holding a phone. "I have something to show you about my mum." The lawyer's eyes widened as he watched the video. The shocking truth was about to be revealed. Want to know what happened? Watch until the end and don't miss this story full of emotions and unexpected twists. Also, tell us which city you're watching from, write it in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more exciting stories like this one. Christine's hands trembled as she stood in the dimly lit courtroom, her chest tightening with every shallow breath. The air was thick with judgment, the eyes of strangers stabbing at her like daggers. She glanced over her shoulder and locked eyes with Ava, her 8-year-old daughter clutching a tattered teddy bear to her chest. Tears shimmered in the child's wide, terrified eyes. The look of fear on Ava's innocent face shattered Christine's heart into 1,000 pieces. The judge's gavel hovered in the air, suspended in cruel anticipation. Christine's world had collapsed so quickly it left her breathless, her knees shaking beneath her, as if they might give out at any moment. The weight of the accusations had grown heavier with each passing day, crushing her spirit and leaving her to suffocate under the pressure of injustice. Just a month ago, Christine's life had been a different kind of struggle. As a single mother, working as a waitress at the upscale restaurant La Belle Dine, she endured grueling double shifts just to keep the lights on and food on the table. Rent was overdue, Ava's shoes were worn down to nothing, and Christine's body ached from the endless hours spent on her feet. But no matter how exhausted she felt, she always pushed forward. Because of Ava. Because of the smile that lit her daughter's face when she stumbled through the door each night, barely holding herself together. Ava had started working on a school project called My Hero, a simple documentary using Christine's old phone. "My mum works harder than anyone in the world. She's my hero." Ava's tiny voice echoed in one of the recordings, her words a beacon of light during Christine's darkest days. Christine watched those recordings whenever she felt the crushing weight of life bearing down on her. They were Ava's gift to her, a reminder that her sacrifice meant something. And despite her exhaustion, Christine always tried to smile for the camera, to show her little girl that she was stronger than her pain. But desperation made people vulnerable. When Mr. Reynolds, the restaurant manager, approached her with a sly grin and the promise of double pay for working an exclusive private event, Christine swallowed her pride and accepted. The offer was too good to refuse. She needed the money. Needed it more than anything. For Ava's school supplies, for the overdue rent, for a shred of dignity in a life that seemed determined to crush her. How could she have known that Mr. Reynolds' smile was a mask, his kindness a weapon? The truth was, she had walked straight into a trap. What came next was a nightmare unfolding in slow motion. The morning after the private event, Christine walked into the restaurant feeling a rare flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, she could pull herself and Ava out of the financial hole they were sinking into. But hope was a cruel joke. Two uniformed police officers waited by the entrance, their faces hard and unreadable. Mr. Reynolds stood beside them, arms crossed over his chest, a satisfied smirk twitching at his lips. He wasted no time pointing at Christine as if she were nothing more than a pest. "That's her," he said with disgust. "She's the only one who had access to the safe last night." Christine's stomach twisted, bile rising in her throat. What are you talking about?" The officers didn't bother explaining. They grabbed her by the arms, their grip rough and unyielding. She was dragged through the restaurant like a criminal, her protests drowned out by Mr. Reynolds's cold, detached voice. "Over $10,000 is missing. The cash was found in your locker this morning," he said. "You really thought you'd get away with it?" "I didn't take anything. I would never." "Save it for the police," he snapped, his eyes gleaming with vicious satisfaction. "Maybe they'll believe you. But I doubt it." The locker search was a blur of humiliation and disbelief. Cash neatly stacked where Christine knew there should only be her crumpled apron and personal belongings. She stammered, tried to explain, but the officers only shook their heads, their patience running thin. They took her downtown, handcuffs biting into her wrists. Her pleas for someone to listen, someone to believe her, were met with stone-cold indifference. Christine's only thought was of Ava. Who would pick her up from school? Who would explain why her mother wasn't there? The interrogation that followed was nothing more than a formality. No one cared about her innocence, only the so-called evidence Mr. Reynolds had conveniently prepared. The surveillance footage from the night of the theft had mysteriously gone offline, and several co-workers, likely bribed or intimidated, had testified that Christine had been acting suspiciously. It was all part of the plan, a perfect, malicious scheme to ruin her life, and Mr. Reynolds made sure the whole world would believe his lies. Christine's life unraveled faster than she could comprehend. The headlines splashed her name across the front pages: Waitress caught stealing from generous employer, accompanied by grainy, unflattering photos of her being dragged out of the restaurant in handcuffs. Reporters camped outside her tiny apartment, their cameras flashing like vengeful stars every time she dared to step outside. The phone calls were the worst, strangers hurling insults, voicemails filled with threats. Even her own neighbors avoided her like she was carrying some infectious disease. But the cruelty didn't end there. Finding a new job was impossible. Restaurant managers, hearing the gossip Mr. Reynolds had spread, slammed their doors in her face. It didn't matter how much she begged, how earnestly she explained that she had been framed. Their judgment had already been made. The little money Christine had managed to save was gone in an instant, spent on overpriced legal help that amounted to nothing more than empty reassurances and a defeated shrug. Her lawyer, Mr. Carter, was an overworked public defender, juggling too many cases at once. The bags under his eyes were as deep as his skepticism. "Christine, I'm doing the best I can, but there's not much to work with here. The evidence is damning. Maybe if you accept the plea deal, you'll be out in a few years." A few years. The words echoed like a death sentence. And for what? A crime she hadn't committed. Her chest tightened, her breaths coming shallow and sharp. Everything she had built, every sacrifice she had made for Ava, was crumbling before her eyes. But even as her own world disintegrated, she tried to shield Ava from the worst of it. Christine forced herself to smile through the tears, reassuring her daughter that everything would be okay. But Ava was perceptive, her innocence already tainted by the cruelty of the world. The little girl cried herself to sleep most nights, her tiny hands gripping her teddy bear as if it was her last connection to safety. Meanwhile, Mr. Reynolds enjoyed the fruits of his deception. Christine saw him once laughing with friends at a restaurant she'd been thrown out of while begging for work. His expression was smug, his confidence unshaken. Christine's resolve hardened. She was innocent, but innocence meant nothing in a world so quick to judge. The trial date loomed ahead like a shadow, but Christine refused to give up. For Ava's sake, she had to find a way to survive this nightmare. Sleep was a luxury Christine could no longer afford. Nights bled into days as she wrestled with the nightmare her life had become. Every time she closed her eyes, all she could see was Ava's frightened face, the child's innocence crushed. Under the weight of this nightmare, desperation turned into determination. As Christine replayed the events of that awful night over and over, something gnawed at her. The way Mr. Reynolds had looked at her during the arrest, satisfaction mixed with something darker. And then it clicked. It wasn't just cruelty. It was revenge. Her thoughts raced back to that horrible night months ago when Mr. Reynolds had cornered her in the empty storage room after closing. His words were still fresh in her memory, the slimy tone of his voice as he whispered his sickening propositions. "You're a pretty girl, Christine. You shouldn't have to struggle so much. I could make things a lot easier for you if you just gave me a chance." The suggestion was coated in fake kindness, his gaze trailing over her like something to be owned. Christine had pulled away, her body stiffening with disgust. "I'm not interested, Mr. Reynolds," she'd said, her voice trembling but firm. "I just want to do my job and go home." His smile vanished, his eyes narrowing with icy resentment. "I see how it is," he'd spat. "Women like you think you're too good for men like me. But remember, Christine, I'm the one in charge here. People who cross me usually regret it." She had brushed it off at the time, hoping he would lose interest and move on to another victim. But now, in the harsh light of everything that had happened, she understood. He hadn't just wanted her attention, he wanted her submission. And her rejection had wounded his twisted pride. Firing her wasn't enough for Mr. Reynolds. He needed her to suffer, to be humiliated, to lose everything, and he had succeeded. The trap had been perfectly laid, designed to leave her with nothing but hopelessness. The way he had spread the lies so easily, poisoning the minds of everyone around her, made Christine's blood boil. She wanted to fight back. But how could she? Her lawyer had already told her that the trial was a lost cause. All the evidence pointed at her, and Mr. Reynolds's influence was enough to keep the truth buried. But as Christine looked at Ava's tear-streaked face that night, something ignited within her. A desperate, ferocious will to protect her daughter, to prove her innocence, to make Mr. Reynolds pay for every cruel, calculated move. She just didn't know how. Not yet. Days turned into weeks of pure agony. Christine's face became a magnet for scorn and ridicule. Her reputation had been shredded to pieces, her name twisted into a cruel joke whispered in alleyways and online forums. And all the while, Mr. Reynolds continued his life of privilege, his reputation untouched, and his lies accepted as truth. Every attempt Christine made to prove her innocence ended in failure. Lawyers dismissed her case as unwinnable, some refusing to even hear her side of the story. Once they learned who her accuser was, the few who agreed to help only drained her dwindling savings before abandoning her altogether. She found herself staring at the eviction notice posted on her apartment door one rainy evening. The words blurred through her tears as she ripped the paper from the cracked wood, her hands trembling. Without a job, without money, and without hope, she was running out of time. But worst of all, Ava was suffering. Christine noticed the way her daughter's eyes had lost their usual sparkle. Ava no longer spoke of her school project, my hero. Instead, the little girl spent most of her time curled up in bed, clutching her teddy bear like a lifeline. Christine's heart shattered every time she looked at her. The trial was only days away. Mr. Carter, her appointed lawyer, had already made it clear he saw no way out. His voice was dull, his gaze empty as he presented her with the last plea. Deal from the prosecution. 5 years in prison, Christine. It's the best you're going to get. Without any real evidence to prove your innocence, a jury will bury you. His words echoed like a death sentence. She couldn't do it. She couldn't leave Ava alone in this world, forced to grow up with the stigma of being the thief's daughter. But what choice did she have? That night, Christine sat by Ava's bedside, watching her little girl sleep. Her breathing was shallow, her small face twisted in a restless dream. Christine's hand shook as she brushed a strand of hair from Ava's forehead. "I'm sorry, sweetheart," she whispered. "I failed you. I've tried so hard, but I don't know what to do." The despair was overwhelming. But in the darkness, a spark of determination flickered. Maybe the world had already judged her guilty. Maybe there was no way to clear her name, but she would not give up. For Ava's sake, she had to keep fighting. Sleep had become nothing more than a distant memory. Christine spent every waking hour searching for something, anything, that could prove her innocence. Desperation had turned her into a shadow of herself, eyes red from countless sleepless nights, hands trembling from exhaustion and fear. But despite her determination, the evidence remained stacked against her. No surveillance footage, witnesses, paid off by Mr. Reynolds, a mountain of lies burying her alive. And with the trial just a day away, even her feeble hope was beginning to fade. Ava had tried to be strong through it all. Her small, trembling voice would insist that things would be okay, even as the other kids at school taunted her, calling her cruel names Christine couldn't bear to repeat. It wasn't fair. None of it was fair. Christine's lawyer had all but abandoned her, already resigning himself to the outcome. When she tried to reach him by phone that morning, his tired voice offered nothing but more hollow reassurances. "Christine, I've told you already. Without proof, the jury will take Mr. Reynolds's word over yours. I've done everything I can." The call ended with a sickening finality. She was truly alone. It was Ava who pulled her from the depths of despair. That night, as Christine sat at the kitchen table, her head buried in her hands, she felt a gentle tug on her sleeve. Ava's eyes were wide and solemn, her small hand clutching Christine's old phone. "I made something for you, Mummy," Ava whispered. "It's my documentary, the one I was doing for school." Christine's throat tightened, the warmth of Ava's touch momentarily melting the ice in her chest. "Sweetheart, now's not the time. Please, Mommy, just watch." Too exhausted To argue, Christine took the phone from her daughter's outstretched hands. Ava climbed onto her lap, wrapping her arms around her mother's neck. The screen lit up, and the familiar image of Ava's smiling face filled the screen. "My mom works harder than anyone in the world. She's my hero." The video was a collection of clips Ava had recorded over the past few months. Christine wiping. Down tables, pouring coffee with a tired smile, returning home late at night only to be greeted by Ava's joy. But then, something else appeared on the screen. Something Christine hadn't expected. Ava's voice lowered, her tone suddenly serious. "I was trying to make the best movie ever, so I filmed a lot of stuff at your work, even when I was waiting for you to finish your shift." Christine's heart stopped, because what she saw next was the answer she'd been praying for. Christine's breath caught in her throat as she watched the screen. The footage Ava had captured was grainy, the angle shaky and uneven, but the content was unmistakable. The clip showed Mr. Reynolds creeping through the dimly lit office at La Belle Dean late at night. His eyes darted around nervously as he stuffed bundles of cash into a black bag with frantic precision. Sweat glistened on his forehead, his fingers fumbling as he tried to close the bag. But it was his voice that sent chills down Christine's spine. His words were low, his tone dripping with arrogance and malice. "I made sure the cameras are off. Tomorrow that woman is going down for good. She thinks she can reject me. We'll see about that." Christine's hand flew to her mouth, her body frozen in shock. This was it. The proof she had been so desperately searching for. The evidence that Mr. Reynolds had orchestrated the entire scheme to destroy her life. And her little girl had unknowingly captured it all on film. "Ava, did you record this?" Christine's voice was a shaky whisper, her eyes never leaving the screen. Ava looked down, her fingers twisting nervously around the hem of her shirt. I was waiting for you that night, remember? You told me to stay outside until you were done. I got bored, so I started filming everything. I just wanted to make my movie special. I didn't even remember this part was there until today." Tears streamed down Christine's face as she pulled her daughter into a tight embrace. Relief flooded her chest, mingling with an overwhelming sense of gratitude. Ava's innocent project had saved her, but there was no time to waste. The trial was scheduled for the following morning, and Christine needed to make sure this evidence was brought to light. She rushed to her phone, her fingers trembling as she dialed Mr. Carter's number once more. To her surprise, he answered on the first ring. His voice was irritated, but Christine didn't care. "Mr. Carter, I have proof, real proof. You need to see this before the trial." "Proof?" he repeated, the doubt thick in his voice. "Christine, this better not be another wild goose." "Chase, it's not," she insisted, her voice firmer than it had been in weeks. "Please, just watch the video. It's our only chance." A long silence hung between them before Mr. Carter finally relented. "Fine, bring it to the courthouse tomorrow. But if this is some desperate attempt—" "It's not," Christine cut him off, her conviction solid and unshakable. "I'll see you tomorrow." As she hung up, Christine held Ava close, her tears now flowing freely. Hope had returned, stronger and brighter than ever. The courtroom buzzed with restless energy as Christine walked in, her shoulders squared with newfound determination. For the first time in weeks, she felt a glimmer of hope. Clutching her old phone tightly, she avoided Mr. Reynolds's smug gaze and took her place beside Mr. Carter. Her lawyer's expression remained skeptical, but he had at least agreed to review the footage before the trial began. After watching the clip, his face had turned pale, his hands trembling slightly as he whispered, This changes everything." But Christine had no time to bask in his astonishment. The trial was starting, and she needed him to be at his best. The prosecutor delivered his closing argument with the same practiced disdain, painting Christine as a desperate woman willing to steal from the very establishment that had shown her kindness. Mr. Reynolds sat in the front row, his arms folded, his confidence radiating from him like a toxic aura. The judge's gavel hovered once again, ready to crush whatever remained of Christine's life. But Mr. Carter rose from his chair, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "Your Honor, before a verdict is reached, I must present newly discovered evidence that is essential to this case." The judge's eyes narrowed. "Mr. Carter, we're minutes away from the conclusion of this trial. This better be worth our time." It is, Mr. Carter insisted. What you're about to see will reveal the truth behind this entire scheme. He plugged Christine's phone into the court's projection system. The room fell silent as the screen lit up, displaying the shaky footage Ava had recorded. Christine held her breath, her hands clenched so tightly her nails bit into her palms. The clip played. Mr. Reynolds's face filled the screen, his greedy hands stuffing cash into the black bag, his words clear and irrefutable. I made sure the cameras are off. Tomorrow, that woman is going down for good. She thinks she can reject me. We'll see about that. Gasps echoed through the courtroom. Murmurs rippled from the jury box. Mr. Reynolds shot up from his seat, his face contorted with panic. That's fake. A setup. This is all some pathetic attempt to frame me, but the damage was done. The judge's expression hardened as he signaled for security to restrain Mr. Reynolds. His shouts of denial continued even as he was dragged from the room, his arrogance crumbling into desperate fury. The prosecutor stammered, his case falling apart before his eyes. Your Honor, given this new evidence, the charges against Miss Christine should be dropped. Agreed, the judge replied, his voice firm. All charges against Christine Hayes are hereby dismissed, and I will be recommending an immediate investigation into Mr. Reynolds's conduct. Relief swept through Christine's body, her knees nearly giving way as tears spilled down her cheeks. Ava rushed into her arms, her small body trembling with joy. I knew you didn't do it, Mommy. I told you everything would be okay. Christine held her daughter close, her voice breaking with emotion. No, sweetheart, you made everything okay. You saved me. Outside the courthouse, reporters clamored for interviews, their questions blurring into white noise. But Christine didn't care. She had her freedom. She had her daughter. And at last, she had justice. Christine walked away from the courthouse, with Ava's hand clutched tightly in her own. The sun felt warmer, brighter, as if the world itself had been waiting to embrace her once again. As she looked down at her daughter's beaming face, the harsh months of suffering melted away like shadows before dawn. The truth had come out. Mr. Reynolds's reign of terror was over, his arrogance shattered by the innocence of a child's video recording. And Christine? She was free. The restaurant's owner, horrified by the truth, not only offered her a generous settlement, but also a management position, recognizing her dedication and integrity. But for Christine, no amount of money or recognition could compare to what she had found in the darkness. Courage, strength, and most importantly, the love of her daughter, whose bravery had changed everything. As mother and daughter walked away from the chaos, Christine knelt down and cupped Ava's face with trembling hands. You saved me, Ava. You're the hero of this story. Ava giggled, her eyes shining with pure joy. But you're still my hero, Mommy. You always will be. Christine's tears came freely then. Tears of relief, gratitude, and overwhelming love. Together they stepped into a future that finally held something she had nearly forgotten how to feel. Hope.